Hello everybody, first off I think I should address this this cut that I've got on my eye. Yeah, basically I walked into a wooden beam the other night. I think I was sleepwalking, but beer might have had something to do with it as well. Anyway, aperture. Aperture, I think when I was learning photography, say when I was learning, you're always learning photography, but when I was a beginner, aperture was probably the most exciting thing to me because it had a huge impact on what my images look like. And typically what I found when I was a beginner, and I think this is common among beginners, is that I did one or two things that pretty much always isn't the best thing to do. Number one, I would shoot wide open because I always wanted to have a blurry background, or I just wanted my subject to properly stand out in the frame. And that just always looked quite good to me. And number two was that if I had like a landscape or a shot that I wanted everything in focus for, I'd close my aperture right down. The trouble is, neither of those things are ideal, and quite often they're not necessary either. So we'll start with shooting wide open. So that typically means shooting at an f number like 1.2 or 1.4 or 1.8 or 2.8 or whatever the smallest f number your lens is capable of. Now the problems involved in doing that, well, I think there's three main ones. The first is that if you're shooting at a really small f number, you'll have a razor thin depth of field. Now that means that if you're taking a photo and either you or your subject moves between you focusing and taking that photo, you're going to miss your focus. And that's just going to make a useless shot, and you might not get the chance to take that photo again. What it also means is that there's a lot of pressure on your camera to nail the focus exactly right, and quite often even the most modern cameras don't exactly do that. The second problem with shooting wide open is that you're letting an awful lot of light hit your sensor, and the problem with doing that is that your shutter might not be able to keep up with it and therefore might not be able to give you the correct exposure. So your shutter might only be capable of a shutter speed of 4,000th of a second or 16,000th of a second or 32,000th of a second if you're using an electronic shutter. But if you're letting so much light in that it still can't expose quickly enough to give you the correct exposure, then you're going to end up with lots of overexposed images, which your camera does warn you about. But when you're a beginner, you're encouraged not to chimp, and chimping is this basically. You take a photo, look at it, take a photo, look at it, take a photo, look at it. You get the idea. And you're told not to do it primarily because while you're looking at your photos that you've just taken, you're missing the opportunity for other photos that might be better. So you're told to just wait until you're at home and then you can look at your photos. But if you're worried about your exposure and you're not going to notice your camera's warnings, which you're likely to do when you're a beginner, then that's just going to encourage you to chimp, which is going to force you to miss shots. And the third problem with shooting wide open is that I don't know of a lens in existence that performs at its best when you shoot wide open. Typically, whatever your lens is, it'll be sharpest somewhere around the middle of its aperture range. So if it can shoot between f1.8 and f16, then typically something like f8 or f7.1, those will be the sharpest apertures. And therefore you might have a photo of a really dreamy, blurry background and a nice subject, but it's not as sharp as it could be, and that may or may not be a problem to you, but it's worth noting. Okay, so that's shooting wide open, but what about the problems with shooting really super closed down? The first is called diffraction. It's a bit technical and complicated and boring, to be honest, but basically when you shoot through a really small hole, when the light enters that hole, it diffracts. And basically light bends, and that causes soft images. So you might have an image where everything is in focus, but none of it will be particularly sharp, and that, I think we can all agree, is not ideal. The second problem with shooting with a really tiny aperture, I think I can stop doing that now, is that you'll end up needing a really slow shutter speed to let enough light in to get a correctly exposed image. Now, that's fine if you're shooting on a tripod and you've got nothing moving in your frame, but if you're hand holding or you've got things moving in your frame, either a model's hair or trees moving in the background, then you're not going to be able to do that. Now the good news is that quite often you don't need to shoot wide open, you don't need to shoot really closed down. So for example, if you shoot at something like f4 on a full frame body or even a crop body, you'll end up with a nice shallow depth of field, provided that your subject is relatively close to the camera and you haven't got a super wide angle lens. Similarly, if you shoot at f8 and you've got a landscape shot where you've got trees and stuff in the foreground that might be a mile away, and you've got mountains or whatever that might be 6 miles away, you might think that 5 miles is a really big depth of field and therefore you need a really small aperture. Not quite the case. You only really need to be looking at f16 or f22 or something like that when you've got something that's meters away from your camera and a background that's miles away and you want both of them in focus. That is a really, really big depth of field, and you do need small apertures for that. But because of the problems associated with small apertures, like I've been talking about, quite often in that kind of case, you're better off using other techniques like focus stacking. Focus stacking is where you take lots of different images, focusing in lots of different places, and then you mesh those together to give you an image that's focused all the way through it. Not ideal in lots of situations, but modern cameras quite often can do it in camera. You don't even need to use Photoshop or any software to do it. But my solution for not shooting at the extremes of apertures is to start at sort of f8 or f7 or f9, somewhere in the middle of the aperture range. From there, I ask myself a couple of questions. Fairly simple questions, but they're as follows. Do I have enough light? So, am I happy with my shutter speed? Am I freezing the action like I want to, or am I getting movement like I want to? And depending on the answer I get to that question, I might decide to play with my aperture. The second question is, again fairly obvious, is too much or too little of my subject in focus? Again, if the answer is yes, then I'll end up tweaking my aperture. But the beauty of starting somewhere in the middle of the aperture range is that I rarely get down to anything like 1.4 or f16, so I end up with a much more sensible shutter speed, and my image is sharper because it's not too wide and it's not suffering from diffraction. So if I start at f8, I may well end up at something like f4 if I want a more blurry background or a faster shutter speed, or I may end up at something like f11 if I want more of my subject in frame and I want to create some motion in the image. But I'll rarely end up at the extremes, and that's good because any mechanical thing really, photography equipment or cars or computers, they rarely perform best at their extremes. And therefore it's best to avoid the extremes. Yeah, so that's that, aperture. Hope that was useful. Probably best for beginners. If you're not a beginner, you might be sort of dropping off by now, but I appreciate you watching anyway. And yeah, I'll see you next time, hopefully when my forehead has recovered.